happy Easter. I hope you're keeping safe and well. Over the years, I've collected a number of objects and texts and images associated with the history of Christianity, and some of them relate to Easter, and I would like to share some of them with you today, as we're all confined to our homes and not able to celebrate it together. So I hope you enjoy them. Of course, many Christians would be expecting to celebrate Easter at church, but as that's not going to be possible this year, I'm going to show you some objects that have emerged from a domestic context. Examples of private piety produced in the home. And the first thing I'd like to show you is a piece of paper. It's actually a painting, a very, very small private painting made on paper that has been perforated on a printer and was used for small embroideries, decorations of various kinds. And in this case, what we have is a devotional illustration to a text by St. Augustine. It was produced in the 1840s. The date is on the back, very precise in fact. The 18th of October, 1844. And it represents this text, which you can see at the bottom right. It says, "Write, Lord, your wounds in my heart, that I might read your love and grief in them." Now, the image is rather an obscure one, and what it shows is precisely that in a certain sense, and it's a very good example of how visual metaphors became a part and parcel of Christian iconography. But many of these metaphors make perfect sense when spoken. For instance, the idea of a heart being on fire is something that people might talk about in poetry quite frequently, but the idea of the image of a heart on fire, or indeed the heart as an image of the heart of God or Christ being represented as a painting on an easel, suddenly these images take on a quite obscure feeling about them. So what we're seeing here is the heart of Christ surrounded by the instruments of the Passion. It's hovering in the sky above a landscape. Around the blazing heart we have the spear and sponge used at the crucifixion to pierce Christ's side and give him vinegar to quench his thirst, the crown of thorns hanging from the spear, the 3 nails used on the cross, and the ladder used at the deposition. And on the left, on the easel, we have the cross with, again, some of the same instruments of the Passion and a dove holding an arrow, significant perhaps both of the Holy Spirit and also the wound in the heart of the Christian, who is asking to be wounded in order to increase his or her devotional identification with Christ. So hoping, as it were, to appropriate some of his grace by identifying with his suffering, sometimes self-imposed suffering. In the Middle Ages, orders of flagellants would deliberately wound themselves in order to identify with Christ in this way. And so this concept has been set in quite a surreal image of a heart in a landscape. There's a castle top left and a village next to a willow tree on the right, perhaps symbolizing the ascent of the Christian soul from this world to the heavenly Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. So this is the first thing that I want to draw your attention to. Also relating to St. Augustine, who was revived. The popularity of St. Augustine was quite substantial in the 19th century. Of course, he was a 5th century saint, a doctor of the church, famous not least for his Confessions, one of the first autobiographies, in effect, in which he examines the movements of his soul for more or less the first time in Christian history. And what we have here is a piece of paper that has been pierced with pins. You can see the whole drawing is made with pinholes. So it's also domestic devotion. It was probably made from a kind of template. There are holes in the corners indicating that the object was pinned down, maybe to another image of the saint, through which it was pricked. It's extremely fine, lovely work. You can see different kinds of pinholes. There are sort of ridges around some of them. They're raised. So his beard, for instance, has texture. It's probably French. You can see from the spelling of the name of the saint. And this is also to do with domestic skill. Now, if I hold it up to the window, you can see it's very beautiful and full of fantasy, full of imagination. But also one striking quality about it, of course, is the amount of work involved in the production of it. So the very act of producing it is a devotional act requiring the greatest concentration. And that's one of the characteristics of some of these devotional objects produced at home. Another thing that relates rather closely to it, also produced in the same context, is this very beautiful cross mounted on a piece of thick silk, rather glorious silk. It's also made out of perforated paper. Again, that will have been bought as a kind of continuous net, and then you at home could punch out some of the pieces of paper in order to create the image that you wanted. In this case, the image resembles the carpet page, so-called carpet page of some ancient Celtic and later manuscripts in which decorative crosses were sometimes included. So if you Google, for instance, the Book of Kells or the Book of Lindisfarne carpet page, you'll see these very, very glorious crosses, some of which look a little bit like this. And you can see at the top it's been stitched down onto the silk. So again, it's a kind of abstract meditation on the nature of the cross. Also relating to the cross is another very extraordinary piece. It's a curious piece of antiquity on the crucifixion of our Saviour and the two thieves. And it's a kind of so-called acrostic image. This is also produced probably at the beginning of the 19th century. It's based on a poem that was written by a man called William Browne much earlier in the 17th century. O God, my God, in rivers of my tears. And this is a curious thing because it works in a double way. So first of all, you can read straight across the page, including the letters and words in the bars that form crosses themselves. So for instance, O God, my God, in rivers of my tears. And then further down, let not, O God, my faults, though great and numberless, be between thy mercy seat. You can see the word is split over the central cross. Now, what makes it an extraordinary thing is that the crosses also have independent texts. So the center one can be read, of course, INRI, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, as inscribed on the cross, and then you can read it as, O God, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then on the left cross we have the good thief, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. And then on the right we have, if thou beest the Christ, save thyself. and us. So it's a clever and challenging object, and the difficulty in reading it is designed to mirror the difficulty in understanding the true significance of this event. It's a piece of concrete poetry, really. It actually goes back to an ancient tradition of which there are great examples in the 8th and 9th century, written by a man called Rabanus Maurus, a treatise on the Holy Cross, when he writes the text across the page but includes images over the text, and the text that falls within the image adds up to an independent text as well as also contributing to the whole page. And here's an example of that taken from the internet. I'd like now to show you another image in which several layers of meaning are conflated, and in this case it's an image of St. Joseph holding the Christ child. Quite an unusual image in Christian iconography. And it's interesting to notice that Joseph is a young man here, whereas according to the apocryphal scriptural sources in which the story is told, he's said to be an old man at the time of Christ's birth. Which is one of the reasons why he was surprised to find his wife pregnant before he was reassured by an angel in a dream. He's identified here by attributes. He shares the lilies with the Virgin, and he's named at the bottom in Italian. The object was made by an Italian, Luigi Toscano, also identified at the bottom here. It's a coloured print. But what's especially extraordinary about it is its construction, because as you can see it's made up of several strips of images placed over the image of Joseph. So when one moves to the left, for instance, we see an image of Christ holding his heart, surrounded by the crown of thorns and surmounted by a cross, identified at the bottom, the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And then on the right you have an image of the Virgin also holding a heart, this time a flaming heart, as in the first object we looked at, also pierced by a sword, as described in the Gospels. And so the object has a kind of religious significance in the way that it conflates the three members of the Holy Family, but it's also a playful and rather ingenious object. In some ways it belongs as much to the history of optical toys and contrivances as it does to the history of Christian iconography. It's contemporary with things like kinetoscopes and kaleidoscopes. It has a sort of playful dimension to it that really associates it with those. The next thing I'd like to show you is very small indeed. In fact, in order to find out what it is, one's got to get very, very close to it. It transpires that it is a tiny piece of paper covered in the most minuscule text. The whole thing framed rather grandly, partly to show off the exquisite work, but also, I'm sure, to help the owner not lose it. But in order to find out what the text is, one really has to enter into it. That's part of the contemplative process that it expects of the viewer. And eventually one discovers that it's the Lord's Prayer. And what's remarkable about it is that it's written with such fluency that it looks as if it was done quickly. One can get some impression of the size of it by comparing it to a pencil. She must have been using something even smaller than this, maybe a tiny needle, and she must have been completely and utterly immersed in the activity. It's not completely clear when it was made, but there's a monogram on the back. And this suggests that it was made in 1772 or 1798. Not completely clear what these numbers signify, but that would be consistent with the style of the object as a whole.
In fact, here are two other examples of the prayer, also made in the 18th century. Typically, these things were made by girls or young women during long hours spent at home. This sampler, embroidered in silk, was made by a 9-year-old girl in 1729. This example, cut from a single sheet of paper, was made in 1786. These exquisite objects demonstrate their maker's piety, domesticity, discipline, literacy, and general eligibility, certainly for grace, but possibly also for marriage. Interestingly, the words eligibility and legibility share the same root, meaning to be picked out, as if to be legible was to be eligible, rather than neglected. But not all words are intended to be legible, as my next object demonstrates.
Talking of the Lord's Prayer, the next thing I'd like to show you is this. It is the Lord's Prayer in 500 languages. The book was published in London in 1905, and in some ways it's like the previous example of the Lord's Prayer that we looked at, in that it's both inviting and at the same time inaccessible, because of course 99.9% of it will be incomprehensible to everybody who looks at it. And in that sense, it's a perfect manifestation of the confusion of tongues that fell upon mankind when he displeased God by creating the Tower of Babel. It's a meditation on the prayer on the one hand and on the multiplicity of languages on the other. It starts off with several versions of the prayer in English before moving into alphabetical order. We have some ancient and defunct languages, cuneiform for instance, from the Babylonian Empire. There's a version in hieroglyphics created specially for the volume. There are also some very intriguing systems of signs that will be unfamiliar to most people, nevertheless very beautiful and intriguing. Some obscure words. Must be a nightmare to have edited this book, and in fact the publisher gloats about it somewhat in the preface, citing it as an exercise in typesetting. So some of the language signs are very intriguing and really gets one thinking in a certain sense about the nature of verbal expressions, of insights into scripture and psychology and meaning altogether. You may have thought that the text with the Lord's Prayer on it was tiny, but it's nothing compared to what I want to show you now. This is a microscope slide. It's made in about 1860 or maybe a bit later, and it combines the Victorian fascination both with religion and technology. As you can see from the label on the slide, it contains the Creed, a photograph of the Creed. The Creed was the declaration of Christian faith, first made at the Nicene Council in the 4th century, and it's one of the fundamental tenets of Christianity. But the question arises, why would you put it into a microscope slide? When the microscope was first invented in the 17th century, it was used to see things that were otherwise invisible to the naked eye. In the first book of illustrations of things seen under a microscope, Robert Hooke's Micrographia, published in 1665, there's an image of a flea that is so magnified that it didn't fit into the book and had to be unfolded. Delighting in the technology, Hooke also reproduced the point of a pin, the edge of a razor blade, and a full stop. This is my favourite one. It looks like a hairy planet. One can see why Hooke would have relished these new experiences. But why would one go in the opposite direction and take something that is already visible and reduce it in size till it was so small that one could only see it through a microscope? Of course, the maker was also playing with the technology, not only of the microscope, but also photography, which had only been invented about 20 years before this slide was made. In fact, photographs of all kinds of things were miniaturized to be seen in this way. But this particular example also raises a question on another level. Although the physical words of the creed can easily be read with the eyes, can it be so easily understood? In this context, the microscope becomes a kind of symbolic instrument of introspection, reflecting the Christian's process of examining whether the text actually corresponds to what he or she feels when looking inside themselves. So, like many of the other objects that I've shown you, though the content of this slide is easy to understand, it's conventional, the manner of looking at it is complicated and made laborious, structuring the way that we see it, so that the act of looking becomes a kind of metaphor for contemplation. The last object I'd like to show you brings us into the 20th century, and it epitomizes the way Christianity adapts to the conditions of popular culture. Perhaps it's the modern day equivalent to the hot cross bun. It's a tin of chewing gum called Bible gum. The object was made in the 1990s in America, in Alaska to be precise. Apart from showing how the visual culture of Christianity thrives beyond the parameters of fine art, it has some interesting features. Some of them are clearly intended to place it within the context of historical tradition. For instance, it looks a little bit like a medieval casket, enamelled in bright colours, and the script of the words Bible gum is High Gothic. The iconography of the angels trumpeting the glory of God is ancient, as are the rays of God's light emanating like sunbeams. And the scene is set over a range of mountains that evokes the Holy Land in biblical times. Inside the tin are several little paper boxes, each one with 2 pieces of gum in it, one of them for sharing, explicitly expecting the owner to practice kindness and community spirit. Each box also has an instructive text from the Bible in it. This one, for instance, says, "He healeth the broken in heart and bindeth up their wounds," from the Psalms. It actually links up with some of the other objects we've seen. But it has to be said that given the apparently popular dimension of the object, some of the texts are pretty obscure and spoken in quite antiquated language. This one, for instance, says, "Sing unto him a new song, play skillfully with a loud noise." On the other hand, the title, punning on bubblegum, is rather banal. I don't even think one can blow bubbles with it. Well, I have to confess I haven't tried, and not just out of a sense of curatorial integrity. It's also quite striking that given the religiosity of the object, so much of it is covered with commercial and health-related information. Some of the pharmaceutical words on the back wouldn't look out of place in the book of the Lord's Prayer in 500 languages. And the huge barcode looks strangely like the abstract expressionist Barnett Newman's paintings of the Stations of the Cross. Though I'm afraid to say I think it's a coincidence. Overall, the object is an uneasy mix of the archaic and the modern, the sublime and the ridiculous. The object may be highly kitschy, but it is not untypical, and it's got as great a claim to feature in a group of objects about popular Christianity as any other. And so I include it here in this offering, wishing you a happy Easter and hoping you keep safe and well in these strange times.